we've talked about fonts and colors and all that, and how to change all of your elements. So all P elements or something like that. But what if I wanted to just change one of them? So for example, I would want this text, this introductory text at the beginning of my website to be bigger, but not this one. But they're both P tags. So if I made a P selector, I would select both of them and make both of them bigger. And that's not what I want. So how do I get around that? Fortunately, CSS has an answer for that. If I just want to have a fine-grained way of selecting different elements. And that's called this thing. There are these things called classes in CSS. And basically, you add this class attribute to an element, or more than one element, and then you can select it in CSS by first putting a dot and then the name of the class. So dot, then name of the class means select everything that has this class. So there could be multiple elements with this class. They could be different kinds of elements. So I could have a P and an H1, for example, with the same class, and that would get selected. And then you can do things to it just like you would any other element. So what I can do is I can add a intro text class to my paragraph, my introductory paragraph. So I'm calling it intro text because it is my intro text. And then I can write some CSS dot intro text and then say font size 1.2 EM. Okay, well, this property font size kind of makes sense, the size of the text. But what is this 1.2 EM business? Well, most numbers in CSS have to have a unit. In this case, it's a length or a size. And an EM is a way of measuring it. It's kind of not intuitive, but basically an EM means the font size of its container. And we're setting font size based on font size. That's a little bit confusing, but basically what I'm saying is when I say 1.2 EM, I mean make the font size 1.2 times bigger. That's it. You might come across, if you're looking online, something called an REM, which stands for a root EM unit. And it basically means the font size at the root of your document. So the font size in your body or HTML tag. It's a little bit non-intuitive, but there are various reasons that people use them. But we're going to stick with the EM tag for now. Later on, we'll be exploring some other units that you might want to use. But for font size, we're sticking with EM. So I've got everything saved. I go to my web page and I refresh. I'll see that this text is bumped up a little bit in size, just like I wanted it to. But this paragraph down here is exactly the same size. That's great. It's also worth noting just how much of an impact these scale factors make. 1.2 doesn't sound like a lot, but it does make a difference. If I set something like 2, which also doesn't seem like that big a number, this text becomes absolutely huge. So 1.2, while it seems small, does make a big impact. Okay, so that's how classes work, and they allow you to have more of a fine-grained choice on which elements are impacted and which elements are not impacted by your CSS styles. Okay, let's move on a little bit and try and explain some more fundamental stuff. We've so far talked about things like making text bigger and changing the color of text, but we haven't really talked about how elements interact. This thing called layout, which is how these elements are laid out on the page. And what if we want to make them laid out in a slightly different way? For example, this text fills the whole width of my window, and that is quite hard to read because it's a really long line of text. What I'd appreciate is if maybe the text was on a thinner line and there were line breaks instead. And rather than putting them in manually, you'll see a lot of websites automatically have a thinner content container and then some blank space either side for when the window is bigger than the container of the text. So that's an example of when I might want to use layout. So how does this all work? How do things get laid out? Well, you might have already noticed this, but there are two main kinds of elements when we're talking about HTML. Firstly, there are block level elements. Now, block level elements are stacked vertically. Every time you make a new one, it basically starts a new line, for lack of better terms. You'll notice this with your heading elements, your P elements. Whenever you make a new one, they make a new line. So we can take a look at this. this is a P element, and then I close that, and I have a heading element, and that's on a new line. But there are other elements, like my EM tag here, which is around this well, or the strong, which is around this word inspiration, that don't start a new line. They're wrapped with the text. They're wrapped in line. And that's another kind of element. We call them inline elements because they are in line with the flow of text. So block elements flow vertically while inline elements flow horizontally, breaking lines where they need to, even breaking lines inside them when they need to. Something worth noticing here is that it makes a lot of sense for block elements to contain inline elements. You can sort of rationalize how that works. What you can't really think about in your head is inline elements containing block elements. I can't even think of a way to sort of make that make sense. So don't do it. Browsers will probably do something funny if you try and do that. So for example, if I try to put a P tag inside an EM tag, it's not going to work. But it does make sense for block elements to contain other block elements. And I'll explain why you might want to do this in a moment. So we've got this concept of inline and block elements. And we might want to use them to facilitate layout on our page. But we'd probably need to use another element to do this layout. For example, this container that I want to put all my content in to bring it in. But what elements do we have at our disposal? We have these P tags, these H1 tags. They come with all these preconceived ideas that they should be headings or paragraphs and some default styles like the text is bigger or there are gaps between them. This doesn't really fit in with what we want. What we want is a blank canvas that we can just apply styles to. That doesn't come with any preconceived ideas about what it should be. And there are two core elements in HTML that fulfill this exact purpose. They're blank canvases. And these are called Div and Span elements. Not really helpful names, but they are very, very helpful elements. So a div element is an element that is a block element and nothing else. So you can apply styles to it to do whatever you want it to do. A span element, similarly, is an inline element and nothing else. You apply styles to it to do whatever you want to do to an inline element. And over time, you'll use these and you'll figure out, just how useful a tool they are. At the moment, it might seem a bit confusing. But I'm going to use one for the first time to make this content container that brings our website, our website content inwards. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this div tag and a new class. So I'm going to make a new class. I'm going to call it main content. And I'm going to put in some CSS properties that I haven't explained yet. But I'll try and explain as I go, and I will explain in more detail later. So firstly, I'm setting the width of this to 600 px, and px stands for pixels. Just think of pixels, if you're not familiar with the term, as the smallest unit you can have on a screen. It's just a very small thing. What I'm going to do is then I'm going to wrap my content in that. So I'm going to make a div, and then I'm going to edit all this. Then I'm going to close that div. And before applying the class, what I notice is it doesn't change anything. Again, they come with no preconceived ideas about what they should be. And then I'm going to add this class called main content. And then when I refresh the page, we'll see that this text is brought inwards. There are line breaks now. It's much easier to read. This image is still massive, and we'll get to fixing that later. But something that else is frustrating is this text is on the left side of the page. I want it to be in the middle. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add some more CSS. This doesn't make a heap of sense. It's not super intuitive. And I'll explain what margin means later. But if you set margin left and margin right to auto, what you get is centered in the middle of the page, except for this massive image, which, again, we'll get to fixing. So now we've got some more readable text. The whole thing is a lot more breathing room. It's just all in all a bit nicer to deal with. So that's one use for divs. And again, anything you can think of, you could probably put a div to make it used. All right, so moving on, what we've done is we actually applied these things called width and margin, and I want to explain a little bit more about what those properties mean. So these come into something called the box model in CSS, and this describes how elements are sized, what their shapes are, and how they interact with other elements. And they're made up of a bunch of different components. Now, that first component is the content of the element. So that could be implicit, so based on the contents of it. So, as wide or as high as the text demands it to be. Or it could be explicit. So we could say, I want this element to be this size wide and this size high. With our content container, our main container that we just made, we did both. Our width was explicit. We set it to 600 pixels, but its height is purely determined by its contents. As well as that, you've got this thing called padding. Now, padding is the gap between the content and the edges of the element. Now, this simply makes things just look a little bit, gives things a little more breathing room. So rather than your content being butted right up against the edge when you might have a background or a border, you have a little bit of space. Then, as well as that, you've got this thing called border. And just as it describes, it's something of a different color that surrounds your element. And it also has a size. And then finally, you've got this idea of margin. And margin is the space between elements. Again, stopping things from being squished together, giving everything a little more breathing room, making everything look a little bit nicer. So, repeating that, we've got the content, then we've got padding, which is the space between the content and the edges. Then we've got a border, which is an extra bit of something around the edges. And then we've got the margin, which is the space between elements. And using this box model, we can create something. So as an example, what I want to do is turn these links down here into something that look more like buttons. When I originally made my design for this website, I wanted to have these links down the bottom look like buttons, not like links. So that's what I'm going to do. Now, first of all, I'm going to apply a new class to all three of these links. I'm going to call it button. Okay, so now that I've done that, I can make a button selector and it will select all of those elements. Now, first things first, I want the background of them to be that nice bright blue that I set up here. And then I want the color to be a light color so you can read it. All right, so let's make sure that's actually done something. And now we see we've got, it doesn't really look nice, but now I've got some text offset against a different colored background. Okay, that's one step. Next, I want to be able to add padding to make those colored edges a little bit further away from the text. Now, before I can do that, I need to set this display property. And what this lets you do is it lets you change the kind of element that it is. So I've turned an A element from an inline element into something called an inline block element. Now, I know I just told you there are these things called inline or block elements, not that you can combine them into this one super element. Long story short, this is a little bit of both. So it's block in that it follows the box model and things inside it. It can contain block elements, but it's inline in that it will flow with the text. And very importantly, line breaks won't appear inside it. But we need to use it in this case. So next thing I want to do is I want to add some padding. So I'm going to use this EM unit again. I'm going to make it 0.3 EM. And that's looking a little bit better. I quite like the spacing between the top and the bottom, but I think the left and the right could have a little more padding. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this one declaration into 4. So I'm going to say padding top is 0.3, padding bottom is 0.3, but I want to make left a little bit bigger. So maybe 0.8 EM and padding right 0.8 EM. Yeah, it's looking a little bit better. I think the top and the bottom need just a smidgen more. Maybe 0.4. Yeah, I'm happy with that. Okay, so that's one more step. And then there are these underlines that I want to get rid of. So let's get rid of them. So there's this text decoration property. And usually use that to add underlines. So there's an underline that's a valid value for it. But in this case, I want to get rid of it. So I'm going to set it to none. And while I'm here, I'm going to set the font weight to bold to make the text bold. So looking at that, all right, that's looking a little bit better. There are still some things missing. Firstly, I think the text could be, well, I think the buttons could be spaced out a little bit more. and these sharp corners are bothering me. The buttons seem too pointy. So there's this border radius property, which basically makes those pointy corners not pointy. So I can set that to 4 pixels to say to make it kind of round. And now when I refresh, I can see that those are no longer pointy. I don't feel so threatened by them anymore. And finally, I can add a margin of maybe 0.3 EM. Let's see what that looks like. And remember, this is the spacing between elements. And all of a sudden, these buttons starting to look like actual buttons. I might zoom in a little bit, just so you can get a better look. Yeah, I'm happy with how those are starting to look. Okay, so now we've actually used the box model to create these buttons. And they still work like links. I can still click on them, and they can still take me to different pages. Okay, so that's the box model. So now's a good time to sort of stop and take a breather. All right, to summarize, what we want to do is we want to use classes to draw some attention to some elements. One paragraph element instead of all of them. Using this div concept, you can make a container to make the main content of your website just a little bit thinner and a little more readable. You can also make links stand out by turning them into buttons like I've just done. As some more ideas for challenges, you can add some more flair to your buttons by using other properties. Some things I'd recommend exploring is this thing called box shadow. That's quite nice, and we've already discussed border, but I haven't told you how to use it. So maybe you can figure out how to use it. And also, can you try and make other parts of your website stand out using the things we just described? For example, is there a section that you want to make really stand out by changing the color even, and also adding some padding to make it a little more readable? We'll take a breather now. Let's try and work through these things.